Believe it or not, y'all, Tim Duncan.
Tim Duncan spent his whole career building a reputation as the quiet star who let his game speak for him. He avoided trash talk, rarely showed emotion, and kept rivalries out of the spotlight. But even Duncan had moments where opponents pushed him in ways he didn't forget. Now at 49, he's finally shared the names of the players who tested his patience the most, giving us a rare look at the battles that bothered him more than he ever admitted before. The player Tim Duncan definitely hated the most was Kevin Garnett.
He never got out his element one time.
Might laugh at
These two guys had a really complicated relationship. Garnett was one of the first teenagers that went straight from high school to the NBA. On the other hand, Duncan arrived to the league as a grown man who already had 4 years of experience in college. Almost immediately, the two became the faces of a new generation of power forwards. Garnett brought a style built on intensity, versatility, and relentless energy, while Duncan set the standard for fundamentals, patience, and team-first basketball. From the moment their careers overlapped, they were on a collision course. They couldn't have been more different in personality. Garnett thrived on emotion and noise. He was known for constant trash talk, defensive fire, and an almost manic presence that demanded attention. Duncan, on the other hand, carried himself with calm efficiency. He rarely spoke, never taunted, and simply went about dismantling opponents with footwork, bank shots, and rim protection. That contrast made them natural foils. The media loved to frame Garnett as the fiery, emotional leader and Duncan as the quiet assassin, and every matchup between them carried that narrative. The tension only grew as their reputations developed. Off the court, Duncan stayed low-key and kept to himself, while Garnett's psychological warfare became infamous. Years later, stories surfaced about Garnett crossing the line during a game on Mother's Day, allegedly bringing up Duncan's late mother and trash talk. That particular comment was never confirmed, but the rumor stuck and fueled the sense that this was more than just a standard rivalry. It created the image of two contrasting personalities locked in high-stakes battles, meeting again and again in the Western Conference spotlight throughout the 2000s.
He might sit there and laugh at you like, and that's...
On the court, their matchups were must-watch basketball. Spurs against Timberwolves in the late 90s and early 2000s, and later Spurs against Celtics when both players were veterans. Garnett came in with fire. He pressed Duncan physically, talked constantly, and played aggressive defense in hopes of forcing a crack in his opponent's stoic shell. Duncan had no interest in the noise. He answered with efficiency, soft touch off the glass, positioning in the post, and blocks at the rim. The playoff series between them showed the difference in outcome. In 1999 and again in 2001, the Spurs knocked out the Timberwolves despite Garnett putting up strong individual numbers. Duncan always had the edge in advancing deeper into the postseason, reinforcing the image of Tim as the winner and KG as the fighter stuck with weaker supporting casts. Garnett later admitted in interviews that he made it a mission to break Duncan's silence, to rattle him and force a reaction. He never really succeeded. Duncan himself would later say that Garnett was one of the toughest opponents he faced, and one of the most exhausting because the chatter never stopped. Their rivalry stretched more than a decade. In the end, Duncan had the clear advantage in championships and team success. He didn't hate Garnett as a person, but he hated the experience of playing against him. It was mentally draining, a constant battle against someone who never let up. Many around the league consider the Duncan-Garnett rivalry one of the defining clashes at the power forward position. When both reached retirement, the tone shifted. Garnett entered the Hall of Fame in 2020. Duncan followed in 2021, and both speeches reflected mutual respect. Still, the lore of their rivalry lives on, especially the infamous Mother's Day story that fans still debate. Confirmed or not, it symbolized what Garnett represented to Duncan, an opponent who always pushed, always talked, and always forced him to stay locked in. And that, more than anything, is why Tim Duncan counted Kevin Garnett among the players he hated facing the most. Surprisingly, it appears that Tim Duncan didn't really like Michael Jordan like everyone else from his generation.
Tony Gamble, Duncan, Michael Jordan the block.
When Tim Duncan entered the NBA in 1997, Michael Jordan was already at the height of his power. He had 6 titles with the Chicago Bulls, and his name carried weight far beyond the court. For a rookie like Duncan, it wasn't just about adjusting to the league. It was about competing in a game still defined by Jordan's presence. Their careers crossed only briefly, during Jordan's last season in Chicago, and then again when he returned with the Washington Wizards from 2001 to 2003. Even with so little overlap, Jordan's influence on Duncan's generation was clear. What made Jordan such a challenge wasn't only his ability to score or defend. He carried himself in a way that forced opponents to deal with more than just basketball. He talked constantly, applied pressure through words, and created doubt in players who weren't ready for it. Duncan didn't like that side of the game. He was known for being quiet, locked into his role, and uninterested in back-and-forth exchanges. In one of their early meetings in 1998, Duncan put up strong numbers even as San Antonio lost. Reports from that night say Jordan went out of his way to test him, not only with play but with words, seeing if the rookie would crack. When Jordan came back with Washington, Duncan was already in his prime. He was posting MVP numbers and leading the Spurs as one of the best players in the world. Jordan, older but still dangerous, relied on the same tools he always had. He played mind games, kept talking, and tried to pull opponents into battles they didn't want. Their matchups weren't about a rivalry in the standings, but about respect between different stages of greatness. Even so, Duncan later admitted that Jordan was one of the hardest players to face because he never stopped trying to get inside your head. For a player who built his reputation on composure, that was draining. Their numbers were rarely compared directly. Duncan controlled the paint, while Jordan worked the perimeter. What stood out were the little moments. Teammates told stories of Jordan calling Duncan too quiet or too nice to dominate. Duncan didn't let it change how he played, but those were the kinds of jabs that irritated him. In 1998, Duncan scored 19 points against the Bulls, and Jordan recognized his talent afterward. When the Wizards played the Spurs years later, Duncan was putting up 23 to 25 points and 12 rebounds a night, while Jordan, even in his late 30s, averaged around 20. The production was there on both sides, but the weight of those games was in how Jordan went after Duncan mentally, not in the box score.
Jordan, blocked by Duncan.
Duncan later explained that Jordan was one of the players he hated facing, not out of personal dislike, but because of how much effort it took to block out the noise. Jordan's trash talk wasn't random. It was calculated, meant to create doubt. Duncan admitted that Jordan was one of the few who could actually make him uncomfortable on the floor. That kind of effect stayed with him. In retirement, the tone shifted to respect. Jordan praised Duncan as the best fundamental player he had ever seen. Duncan returned that respect by acknowledging Jordan as the measuring stick for his era. If you've been following the NBA for the last decade or so, the fact that DeMarcus Cousins is on the list won't come as a surprise to you.
Frustrated playing against Tim Duncan because I could not figure him out.
By the early 2010s, Tim Duncan was already established as the face of the Spurs, while a new wave of big men were trying to make their mark. One of the loudest of them was DeMarcus Cousins. He had the skill to score inside and out, but he carried a fiery temper that made him stand out just as much as his talent. Where Duncan stayed quiet and let his game speak, Cousins leaned into trash talk, arguing with referees and throwing his weight around against opponents. That difference in approach set up a natural clash. During games against San Antonio, Cousins often barked at Duncan, showing little hesitation in challenging a veteran with 4 championships. It wasn't just on-court talk either. In 2012, things escalated when Spurs commentator Sean Elliott, who was one of Duncan's closest teammates from the early years, called Cousins out for disrespecting Tim Duncan during the game. Afterward, Cousins allegedly confronted Elliott, leading to a league suspension. The story made headlines not because of Cousins' play, but because in San Antonio, disrespect toward Duncan was seen as crossing a line. That incident locked Cousins into Spurs history in a way no other young big man was at the time. On the floor, though, Cousins was a tough cover, even for Duncan. With his size and agility, he could step out and hit jumpers, put the ball on the floor, and muscle his way inside. Duncan relied on his bank shot, positioning, and rim protection, while Cousins thrived on letting people know when he scored. That contrast showed up every time they matched up. Duncan kept things measured, while Cousins made it loud. The Elliott incident only highlighted the tension. Reports said Cousins was mocking Duncan during possessions, something Elliott blasted on air, and the suspension showed how seriously the league treated it.
I couldn't figure him out, and it was just like, no matter how much.
In terms of results, Duncan usually had the edge because San Antonio was a championship caliber team, while Sacramento struggled through constant rebuilds. But individually, Cousins always put up numbers. During those overlap years, he averaged close to 20 points and 10 rebounds, proving himself capable of producing against anyone, even the Spurs' defensive anchor. For Duncan, the problem wasn't only Cousins' skill, it was the attitude, the arguing, the constant chatter. Those were the exact traits he hated in opponents, the things that chipped away at the calm rhythm he thrived on. The impact of those run-ins lingered. Cousins earned a reputation around the league as a volatile star, and his altercation tied him forever to the disrespecting Duncan storyline in San Antonio. Duncan himself never made a big deal of it publicly, but Spurs media often pointed to Cousins as one of the players Tim genuinely disliked facing. After Duncan retired, Cousins softened, speaking more respectfully about legends like Tim. But the reputation stuck. For Duncan's most hated list, Cousins isn't there because of playoff battles or championship stakes. He's there because of how he represented everything Duncan tried to avoid in the game: a fiery personality, a brash style, and a willingness to cross lines of respect. Even without the postseason history of his other rivals, Cousins carved out his own place on that list with one unforgettable controversy. Tim Duncan also didn't like the antics of Draymond Green. Draymond Green began his career with Golden State in a small role, sitting at the end of the bench. Within a few seasons, he became the heartbeat of a team that turned into a dynasty. What separated him wasn't scoring, but the energy he brought to defense and the way he inserted himself into every battle. Green played with versatility, able to guard centers and guards in the same possession, and he talked the entire time. His voice was constant, whether it was aimed at referees, teammates, or the man standing across from him.
That's what he wanted. He wanted to get shot.
By the middle of the 2010s, the Warriors were climbing toward the top of the league. At the same time, the Spurs were still holding on as contenders, with Duncan leading the last stage of his career. That overlap lasted 4 years, from 2012 through 2016. And in that short window, Golden State's rise pushed directly against San Antonio's effort to extend its own run. Draymond's style was loud and confrontational, the complete opposite of Duncan's quiet, methodical approach. Their differences in personality and in how they led their teams created tension before the ball was even tipped. On the court, that clash became obvious. Draymond was the type of defender who leaned on opponents, grabbed at them, and never stopped talking. His goal was to pull a player out of rhythm. Against Duncan, that style stood out even more. Duncan used patience, angles, and fundamentals that he had mastered for years. He never rushed and rarely gave in to emotions. Draymond tested that by forcing physical contact on every possession and running his mouth the entire time. Their battles came to life in the playoffs. The Spurs and Warriors met in 2013, when San Antonio still held the upper hand, and again in 2016, when Golden State had taken the leap to dominance. Draymond matched up with Duncan at stretches, using leverage and intensity to make his shots more difficult. Duncan usually put up better numbers, especially in scoring and rebounding, but the challenge wasn't statistical. It was about how much energy it took to play through the chatter, the bumps, and the constant switching. Green never let anyone rest, and Duncan, who thrived on rhythm, had to adjust every trip down the floor. For Duncan, players like Draymond were the hardest to enjoy competing against. Not because they dominated him, but because every possession became a mix of basketball and distraction. Draymond represented a new type of big man, one who wasn't defined by low-post scoring but by defensive versatility and emotional intensity. Facing that style in the final stretch of his career meant Duncan had to deal with battles that went beyond the box score.
Kind of just left Tim Duncan alone.
After Duncan retired, Draymond spoke with respect about him, calling him the best power forward to ever play. It showed that their tension never crossed into personal animosity. But for Duncan, who valued composure and silence, those matchups were exhausting. Going against someone who thrived on confrontation, who built his game on noise, was the type of challenge he hated most. The Warriors became the new model of success once the Spurs faded, and Draymond was central to that transition. His presence symbolized the shift from old-school fundamentals to a style that embraced versatility, constant switching, and non-stop talk. Looking back, Duncan would likely place Green on his list of most hated opponents, not because of bad blood, but because Draymond embodied everything that pulled him out of his comfort zone. He was the opposite of how Duncan played, and for that reason, he became one of the defining opponents of Tim Duncan's final years. Most surprisingly, Tim Duncan didn't really like his point guard Tony Parker when they first met. In fact, he kind of hated him for his entire rookie year.
I knew he was a great player, but he never talked to me.
When Tony Parker joined the Spurs in 2001, he was barely 19 years old, a teenager from France with speed and raw skill but little experience at the NBA level. Magic, along with Jordan and Bird, had a hand in it, and the unquestioned leader of the franchise. That gap in age, achievement, and personality created a natural test. The Spurs were Duncan's team, and the idea of handing the offense to a young rookie point guard was something he wasn't quick to accept. Early accounts suggest Duncan didn't believe Parker was ready. He doubted whether the rookie had the toughness and composure to direct an NBA offense built to win championships. Duncan was never someone to speak much in the locker room, but with Parker, he was especially distant. Stories from those early years say Duncan barely spoke to him at all, keeping his guard up until Parker proved himself. For Parker, those first months in San Antonio were spent not only learning the game at a higher level, but also trying to win the trust of the star who defined the Spurs. That tension shaped the start of their partnership and set the bar Parker had to reach. Parker's trial by fire came almost immediately. As a rookie starter at point guard, he was tasked with running an offense led by Duncan and expected to hold his own against some of the best guards in the league. The turning point arrived in a matchup against Gary Payton, one of the most feared defenders of his era. Payton's reputation was built on smothering pressure and nonstop talk, and it was the exact type of test Duncan thought Parker might not survive. Instead, Parker rose to the moment. He handled Payton's defense, attacked with confidence, and delivered a performance that proved he could compete with elite competition.
I think he didn't think I could let a point guard from France.
That game flipped the dynamic between Duncan and Parker. For the first time, Duncan acknowledged him as more than just a rookie filling a role. He began to see him as a floor general capable of carrying responsibility. Parker himself has recalled in interviews that Duncan only started speaking to him and showing trust after that night. The coolness between them didn't vanish instantly, but the walls Duncan had built began to fall. From that moment forward, their partnership took shape, built on Parker earning Duncan's respect in the toughest way possible on the floor, under pressure. What followed was one of the most successful partnerships the league has seen. Duncan and Parker went on to win 4 championships together, guiding San Antonio through more than a decade of contention. Still, the memory of those early days stayed with both players. Duncan admitted he had been slow to trust Parker, and Parker often joked later about how Duncan wouldn't even talk to him as a rookie. Those memories reflected not only Duncan's high standards, but also Parker's resilience in proving himself. For Duncan, Parker may have once been a player he hated in the sense of frustration, an unproven rookie thrust into a critical role. Someone he didn't believe in at first. Over time, that relationship transformed into one of deep respect and friendship, a bond that anchored the Spurs dynasty. The story of Duncan and Parker's early tension stands as a reminder that even a superstar as steady as Duncan could be resistant to change until someone truly earned his confidence. Tim Duncan never showed much on the surface, but the truth is, certain players stayed with him long after the games ended. Hearing him admit it now adds a whole new layer to his story. If you enjoyed looking back at this side of Duncan, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more.